So the good news is that I am often, sometimes, invited to be the last speaker at conferences. So hopefully I'll be able to keep you awake. On the downside of it is I'm going to cover a lot of material, basically kind of 3 years worth of work that I've done. And this is part A, in a sense. This is the first part of a two-parter. The problem, a little bit with like the latest Avengers movie, is that it plunges you to the depth of despair, and then we end. So I am, by the time we get to the end of this, I think it's fair to just tell you that I'm extremely optimistic about the human condition and where we're going, but this ends sort of on a negative cliffhanger with some hints of what the future can look like. But so let me, this I think was circulated, and what I'm ultimately talking about is what are the legal consequences in a world where you don't know whether you're in a real world or a virtual world. And does the law have a role to play? Yes. How does it play that role? A little bit more complex. And where do we know? How do we know when the law should intervene? When do we lose our human agency in that world? And is there a way to test for that? What are the remedies? So this is kind of 3 years worth of work in terms of, I think the academics will recognize we all have our favorite conferences where we're treated well. Mine is at Queen Mary University of London at the Center for Commercial Law Studies. And I have spoken at a conference there for 3 years on these topics. And I've just kind of given some common denominators. The second thing I should warn you about is there are a lot of slides here, and I'm going to skip. I've culled them, but I'm going to be skipping very quickly through slides, but I at least wanted you to see them if you ever revisited them. So when I establish a concept, I'm moving on. So step one, imagine virtual reality 3.0. We're at kind of 1.4. Let's say right now. In that world, you cannot tell the difference between what's real and what's virtual, and it is possible that someone can control what you do. We'll come to why and how very easily. Go see it if you haven't. But let's deal with control quickly. This is completely non-digital. And this is a patent application, but I want you to hold this metaphor. And by the way, all the really nasty things I'm going to say about VR, I'm glad I followed the speakers that I did because AR is actually a solution to a whole bunch of these. But that's the part two that we're not going to be talking about today. I'm happy to come back and do the second part if I haven't bored you to tears by talking about law. So how do you control a turtle with human thought? It's a real patent. I'm not making this up. It's actually pretty simple. Turtles, like many animals, will go to the light. So what you do is you project a virtual light field around them, and you open to the light wherever you want, and you just decide where you want the turtle to go by where you leave the open light. So now take that metaphor and apply it to advertising in virtual reality. That's something we think about a lot. Maybe we're thinking a little more about it because of Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and others. So we know people want our information and want to sell us stuff. And virtual reality is going to be a platform for that. And generally speaking, this is from a great academic colleague, there is a delicate balance between appropriating new technologies, controlling them, and being appropriated or being controlled by them. And that's got a lot to do with our human condition. So let's talk a little bit about where we are and what goes on. Kind of basic principle, since I've been teaching technology and communications related subjects, is there's no such thing as a one-way tube. If you can push information in, you can also push it out. If you can push information out, there's a way in. It kind of works that way. So we know we've got devices that read us, whether we want to be read or not. And there's a ton of information, and every day there are more interesting ways we can be read. Not always 100% correctly, but increasingly well. And some of it goes over the top, especially when it gets into military applications. And, mind-reading computers. Elon Musk is in there. I guess your Tesla will be able to read you pretty soon. And all of that goes towards the notion of the singularity, that we are evolving into something that is man-machine down the road. Agree, disagree. There's kind of this evolutionary aspect, which I'm going to come back to. But let's just start here. Last year at the famous Kleiner-Perkins Internet conference, Mary Meeker, if you don't see her stuff, look it up. I think the 2018 version is very boring, but last year's was particularly good. And she suggested, which is interesting for she's a financial person, perhaps interactive gaming, the evolution, growth, and usage of interactive gaming with data collection, analytics, real-time simulations, is helping prepare society for the singularity. That's fascinating for a Silicon Valley financier to suggest this, and you can see, why that may be, because of the kinds of businesses that the Kleiner-Perkins and others are invested in. But if true, it also answers an old question, which is, why do we game? There are psychologists, including my cousin, who said, I can't figure it out. I've spent my life in psychology. I don't understand why people play games. And before he passed away, a couple of years before that, he closed up his lab. He came up with the theory of cognitive dissonance, so he was no small guy in psychology. He closed up his lab because he was so frustrated with not coming up with answers to the big questions, and he actually considered, why do people play games, as a big question. So that actually adds a little bit of weight to what Mary Meeker says, leaving us with, are we, biological as we may be, in fact the next platform? Another thought I want to plant is that for some reason we as humans are particularly susceptible, or seem particularly susceptible, to virtual reality. We're really interested and we seem to react to it very strongly. Why? One, you can go with Yuval Harari and say, well, we love making stuff up. Humans are the only animals that believe in things that exist only in our imagination. When you look at the earth, there are no country lines. Money, the notion of money is a fiction of our imagination. Nation states, religion. I hope I'm not offending anybody. So that's one one trigger. We make stuff up, so virtual reality works with us. Another is famous notion that came out of Oxford. We're all living in a computer simulation anyways, so hey, we're already in virtual reality. No wonder virtual reality works so well. And there are some famous people. I don't know why Elon Musk keeps on showing up, but academic papers, there's a lot of, and then there's this kind of, I've stated in a way, but I'm going to state it a different way. Is this a video game? To me, who's been working with games for a long time, this seems like a video game. The process of creating a model of the world using multiple feedback loops and various parameters in order to accomplish a goal. Won't surprise you, it's not a game, it's a definition of consciousness according to Michio Kaku. So, at the very least, where the definition of consciousness and the definition of a video game, of a virtual reality, seems so symmetrical, there is, at the very least, you don't have to believe we're already in a video game, there's certainly an alignment and therefore a susceptibility. And, you know, we all know what happens with Pokemon Go and other things, and car crashes and various disasters because people can't get out of the virtual reality. It's more pervasive than the fact that they could kill somebody in real reality. So there's a consistency there. There's a vulnerability there. So now, on top of that vulnerability, there comes the difficulties associated with us being manipulated. And with the rise of big data, with the rise of AI, machine learning, our susceptibility can be used against us. Who would use it? Well, those who want to advertise to us, that's the easy part. We now know there are also political implications. All of this on a certain level is very benign. And in fact, you know, I would argue here's a really positive example. House of Cards, when Netflix first produced it, you know, the traditional way to produce a TV series, and I know this from my background, is you come up with some vague notion of what you want, you go to a bunch of producers, and you say, pitch me your best stuff, and then you decide whether you think it'll work for your audience. That's not what Netflix did. Netflix had data, even 6-7 years ago. They knew what their audience was watching, who they liked to watch, what kinds of shows they liked to watch. They took that data, they decided that a political drama starring Kevin Spacey was going to work. And they took that to the producers and said, here's what we know about our audience, now build a show with these elements. And it worked really, really well. Now, I don't consider that problematic because it's aggregated data. But what if we come to a one-to-one future? That's where this gets more and more complicated. We know about addiction. We know that politicians want in. We know how our prejudices can be reinforced. We know that algorithms aren't always correct. And then we come to the future stuff. And I'll just move through these quickly. You know, imagine we go beyond VR to brain stuff. That, you know, we actually can do Vulcan mind melds at some point in the future. This is all actually kind of legit research. This is very explicable. It's fascinating. Watch this documentary, and you will see somebody being faced with a film of their own dream after they've woken up from REM sleep. How do researchers take pictures of a dream? How can they show you your dream? Actually, it's pretty simple. You sit there and you, for like a day, go through thousands and thousands of photos, while your brain is being measured as you watch every photo, and then you go to sleep, and the pictures are matched to the pictures of your brain and reconstructed. And watch the documentary, it's very accurate. But imagine if every picture that you saw, everything that you saw was a picture. How accurate reading your personal thoughts would be, measuring your brain would be, measuring your dreams would be. We've now gotten to the place where false memories, and remember, no one-way tube, right? Brain hackers, et cetera, et cetera. So that leads to when do we lose ourselves? At what point is it possible? Is it possible? Seems clear that it is possible to be convinced of a reality that doesn't exist. From a legal standpoint, we don't want the law to be a blunt instrument. We don't want to outlaw technologies, although there's always an initial flirtation when a new technology comes along that it's destroying society. But we really, for rule of law reasons, want to moderate that as much as possible. We don't want blunt laws, but if people are losing themselves, at some point, the law needs to intervene. And the question is, what is that point and how does the law intervene? I'm going to talk a little bit about that after I get to kind of next series of complications. One hint around this is a wonderful piece from a gaming conference from GDC from a couple of years ago around open world games. And it talks about human agency a lot, and it talks about it in terms of volition. Are you doing what you want to do? It's not exactly freedom. It's kind of non-interference and a positive, I'm doing what I want to be doing. And that's interesting, what volition is. This is not volition. So those of you who are parents will know what I'm talking about. Those of you who don't have kids but obviously have been kids and had parents do this to you, I'm about to reveal the secret. When you want to put your kid to bed, you don't say, do you want to go to bed or do you want to stay up? Because that is not a choice. I see parents already laughing. You say, do you want a hot chocolate or do you want a story before you go to bed? That's not volition. So sorry if it's like telling you there's no Santa Claus. If you're a kid, oh God, that's how they did it. I fell for that. Yes, you fell for that. And it works every time if you're a parent. It's an amazing, amazing thing. That's the illusion of choice. That's not real. That's not volition. As you know, thinking back to your 3-year-old self, you didn't want to go to bed. And you fell for the trick every time. So, proposition is the law should intervene when we substantially lose our human agency to do what we really want to do. So now, see how I'm doing on time? Not bad. So I've asked you to think about VR 3.0. I'm going to ask you to imagine entertainment 4.0. Which I actually came up with this. Colleagues said, did you come up with it? Yeah, I actually came up with it. I have not trademarked it though, so it's vulnerable. Media, and that's where we are right now. And it's, people blame millennials, but the world in the world of technology and entertainment and media is directed to us individually more and more. And that's where we're going. So let's talk about the implications of that. So capital M-E media, I suggest, means storytelling that's uniquely tailored to me. Now, that's not going to be possible if I have to have Martin Scorsese actually make a movie. He'd never be able to make a movie just for the people in this room individually. But AI, big data, makes that possible. And to a certain extent, I want to point out that it already is possible. And this is part of part B, the hopeful part. But I want to just, remember, we are all truly individuals. We know that fingerprint. But all of our smartphones, I guarantee you, not just in this room, but probably in this country, possibly in this world, if you've had a smartphone for more than 6 months, let's say, you will not find two smartphones that have the same apps in the same order. I will almost guarantee you that our smartphones are the equivalent of fingerprints for almost all of us. So there's a lot of uniqueness. And old media doesn't deal with uniqueness well, but new media, like television, radio, it's just a blast of one to many, from literally, I love the word transmitter. It transmits from one to many, and we are all kind of equivalent receivers. We get the same thing, and we don't really interact unless with the media or with old media, except to, like when I swear at Fox News. I've now deleted it, but you get so frustrated. But that's not real interactivity. So imagine an algorithm knew this information about me. My favorite type of movie, which is romantic comedy. My favorite stars, Anna Kendrick and young John Cusack. So here's the trick. I don't want old John Cusack, who's kind of fat and not nearly as amusing as he used to be because he did too many drugs. I want young John Cusack. So my favorite screenwriter, Adam Sorkin, my favorite plot trope, which happens to be time travel that teaches life lessons, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what if we go further and you knew some of my underlying psychological traumas and habits and family details and maybe family issues, my entire personal history. What happens then? What kind of media could be tailored to me? And what does that look like? And what are the risks, the issues, and the legal consequences of that? Now, let's not pretend that content is ever not personal. Even if content is meant for everybody, this is one of my favorite stories. It's about a gamer who lost his dad to illness. His dad passed, and he discovered that there was a saved race. Now, if those of you who are gamers know that in many race games there are ghost cars that go with the best time. So his dad happened to have the best time on the old Xbox. So this guy got to race his dad. And if he ever was beating his dad, he just stopped before the finish line so as to preserve the ghost car of his dad. So, even media that is mass media, in certain circumstances, digital allows it to be imbued with personal meanings, and we also add our meanings to it. So there's a whole discussion of post-structuralism, which you'll be relieved to know I'm not going to do at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on a Friday. But that's a different, it's not a different question. It's all part of this, but let's call it the second part. Is there an additional loss of human agency over the one I described from VR in media, in capital M-E media, in having all this information? Well, it sure makes it easier to lose yourself. If something is so individuated to you, you can see the power of that. And we are at the point where we've got, the capabilities of ultra reality, And we saw that in Star Wars Rogue One. And, you know, we're not going to bring back a young Princess Leia. Lucasfilm actually had to say that. The reason they had to say that was because the technological capability existed. This is not Barack Obama. It sounds like Barack Obama. It's completely convincing. Go look it up, but it's completely made up. You can see how dangerous that is. On and on and on. Digital humans, we're working on it. We've got movies scripted by AI. We've got music scripted by AI. And we're starting the big problem. If anybody here from film, you'll get this. I think everyone will get this. The big problem is direction. Who's the director? We don't have an AI right now that does direction very well. There can be some scripting, there can be music, there can be characters are no issue, as we've seen, but actually making the movie and directing the movie and cutting the movie is something that we're still working on. And there are, of course, great dangers to this kind of ultra reality that start implicating legal issues. And, you know, there's also kind of cool things. Hey, it's actually coming, you know, we can pick endings perhaps to the next generation of Netflix movies. And Will Wright's next game is going to be all about your personal psychology. Your version of the game and my version of the game are going to play out completely differently in every respect. So we are definitely getting to that place. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but the dystopic example is not necessarily what was done, because that's not yet completely clear, but what Cambridge Analytica was trying to do, and by all evidence didn't succeed at, but was certainly trying to. And that was creating content directed to you individually to get you to act and vote a certain way, which might not have been the way you wanted to, or it took away your intentionality. They were trying to take away your intentionality. And leave you with this, the notion, and you'll see this again, of government wanting to intervene. So, I'm not doing too badly. Okay. Step 3, the law. So, this is hard because I know you're a non-legal audience, and I'm just going to do kind of 10,000-foot principles and try and raise some questions. Every single issue I raise here, lawyers will just go on for days and days discussing the minutiae of it. But the first question is, how do we formulate a test? The law loves tests. When do we know when the player is being controlled, or or the viewer is being controlled and is not in control? Now, some of you who, if to the extent you think about legal issues, might say, oh, I know the answer to that. It's those automaton cases that I've heard about in criminal law, where people don't know what they're doing and they kill their spouse, or they do something awful while they're sleepwalking. That must be the test. Regrettably, I have to tell you that those cases, first of all, are very old and are not anything but clear. So it's not really a very useful test in the digital age. Here's kind of how I formulated it. Looking at a lot of stuff. So this is kind of the apotheosis of a paper I did 2 years ago. The law should intervene when data was obtained from an individual without fully informed consent, and the individual's freedom of thought is impacted. And there is actually, if you look at the Charter, if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, freedom of thought is in there. We never talk about freedom of thought, but it is actually a concept allied with freedom of speech and freedom of expression. So it's there. We just have never figured out what it means. And I think VR and the future of media will force us to define it, which is good, because it's actually good it's already there. And that individual's freedom of thought is impacted, causing a substantial risk of harm. It didn't say substantial risk of harm to them, just a substantial risk of harm, because if I'm in effect put under to kill you, that's a problem. Freedom of thought to be defined in terms of personal autonomy and human dignity, not just to make choices, but to make creative choices on one's own terms. On one's own terms, the volitional part is key. There's also a deeper problem here, one that almost nobody talks about. And I actually think it's extremely critical. And it's just not really being discussed. It came out a little bit around the Facebook stuff, the Facebook Cambridge Analytica stuff. And it's this. I'm not going to rely on the slides so much. It's that constitutional structures are intended and overtly between the individual and the state. The state owes me the right, my right to express myself. But a company that I contract with doesn't owe me that. The company I contract with is a person, a corporate person, but a person just like me. And constitutional, charter of rights relationships, both in Canada and the US and other countries, are between citizens and government, and don't apply in the private relationships between citizens and other citizens. And as difficult as it is to imagine, Facebook and Google are other citizens. And in reality, they're of course much more than that. But we expect, almost naturally, these important constitutional principles, whether they be privacy or freedom of speech, to exist with a Google or a Facebook. But unless government intervenes, they don't exist. What exists between us and Google and Facebook is a contract that I can pretty well guarantee none of you have read, because that's what all the stats show. It's a pure contractual relationship whereas we almost instinctively expect a rights relationship, because our day-to-day lives are not governed by the state or a religion or a community or our families nearly as much as they're governed by this. Our norms and our values are much more set by this. And, by what's happening on Instagram. And that's okay. I'm not saying let's do away with that. But this kind of constitutional misplacement is a problem that has to be addressed.
John, could you just back us up one?
Sure. This is just about the trope of, Half-Life of, the government corporation taking over.
It says that constitutional rights aren't available for these relationships, but there is also the history of government intervening.
And I'm coming to that.
Okay.
I'm not in denial, but that requires statutory intervention. That requires legal intervention. So constitutional rights don't apply. My apologies for using this meme. I was assured by my 16-year-old daughter that this is in no way sexist. because I was worried about that I could legitimately use this meme. This is all of us. These are the media companies, the Facebooks and the Googles of the world, and these are constitutional rights and protections that we don't have right now. And again, I want to come back to kind of freedom of thought as an interpretive aid and just show you that it exists constitutionally, exists in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this goes directly to Kelly's point, and that is the question now, especially in the face of Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, is do we regulate? Do we regulate these media industries? And do we regulate them particularly because of the power that they now can possess through AI, big data, using it in VR and advertising to us? The thin edge of the wedge, it turns out, is getting us to buy stuff we don't want or need. You start applying that to the political world. I don't think anyone really expected that. And yet that's what we got this year. And so I always thought this was really interesting. Trudeau last November warned Facebook to start acting properly or they would be regulated, which tells me that the spies were talking to the spies, and we were getting information long before it came out about what Facebook and Cambridge Analytica was doing, because that was the timing of that was unusual. And we have legal scholars pointing this out, like Ryan Kalo at the University of Washington. Problems. Again, I'm hitting this at 15,000 feet and I'm almost done. Is privacy a robust enough concept to protect us? Probably not. And the way we constitute privacy in law is you can consent to losing your privacy. And that's essentially what we're doing in end-user license agreements, et cetera, et cetera. And this is an old problem. Vance Packard, The Hidden Persuaders, was a book about subliminal advertising. So this isn't all new. This is a traditional problem. And regulatory bodies and statutes were introduced that said, hey, no subliminal advertising. So, there are some things here. The way we define privacy is a bit of a problem. In Europe, there's a right to be forgotten, which we don't have here, mandatory right to be forgotten. It does look like the courts might create that. Hey, if you're using my brain data, you got to forget it after you use it. That doesn't seem unreasonable to me. Another, and this is where Europe is right now, they're starting to think about VR seriously, and I sort of have the evidence and the emails, as a drug. Is it a drug that should require licensing? I'm not in favor of that approach. I just, for completeness, want to show you the different approaches. Another approach, which I think is usable now, is we have, the Supreme Court of Canada has said that there is a mandatory duty of contractual good faith. Previously, it was thought you had a duty of good faith negotiation, but once you were in the contract, kind of the literalness of the contract took over. Supreme Court of Canada in 2014 said, no, we are going to look at context. And if you're not using good faith while the contract is on, not just the letter of what's said, but actual good faith, we may consider that a problem. It's still a bit vague because 2014 to 2018 in legal development terms is not a long time. But you can imagine going to Facebook and Google and saying, hey, I wasn't thinking in any way when I signed your incredibly vague agreement that I was giving you my brain data to be used against me. That's not good faith. So, that kind of argument hasn't been done yet, but could we look at them as trustees of our data? That's a tougher one because that requires an agreement, but there is a possibility of that. And a couple of American scholars one from Harvard Law and one from Yale Law, fabulous, awesome academics, have introduced the notion of information fiduciaries and said this is a lot like healthcare. You are, because you have this information, you have a fiduciary duty, which is a very high legal duty, to take care of it and use it properly. And this is one of those academics, Jack Balkin, from Yale, saying, aha, Facebook has admitted, after the Cambridge Analytica controversy, that they are indeed an information fiduciary, that they are responsible for our data. Because that's what Mark Zuckerberg said in that initial set of interviews. Another remedy that could fit is constructive trust, that a court could do right now and say, you know what, you media companies are trustees of this information, and you can't absolve yourself of it. That requires some things, relationship of dependency and reliance of the kind that the US president has on Putin. But it has one other problem, and that is a trust must be of property, and it's not clear what we're going to call our data. Is it property? Is it a property right? I think it probably is, but it's not certain. Now I'm going to leave you kind of with one last thought, which is kind of the big one for the last 3 minutes. I'm going to start in a very weird place. I'm going to get you thinking about copyright, which is important but kind of seemingly mundane in this discussion. But think about mods. Think about modding games. Think about the effort that sometimes goes into modding games and how there's more effort in certain games that's gone into modding it than into developing the game themselves, the original game itself. And this is a game that I love, Grand Prix Legends, which basically was delivered as 10% of the game that it should have been, and was completely fixed by the community in every respect over about a decade-long period, with a lot more effort than in terms of man hours that went into the original game. There was 400 or 500, maybe not 600, individual tracks created by modders, fixing multiplayer, et cetera, et cetera. Think of a card game. You can't have a card game without someone to play with, except for solitaire. But if you're playing cards, you're playing with someone. Think about Minecraft. It's really not about, and the developer said this, it's not about the game. People did amazing things with Minecraft that were completely different than what the developer expected them to do. And then an amazing legal academic by the name of Bruce Boyden asked himself, or for academic purposes, said, we know there is no copyright in the game. There's copyright in the art of a video game or the music, but the game itself, we know there's no copyright. Why is there no copyright in the game? And he did the legal academic thing and went back, and he said there's two possibilities. One is that a game is an idea, not the expression of that idea, and there's something called the idea-expression dichotomy, which means that there's no copyright in an idea, only in the expression of the idea. Copyright is on the art assets, but not on the idea of the game. The other possibility is that a game is a system, sort of like a spreadsheet. There's no copyright in a spreadsheet. All the value is in what people put into the spreadsheet. And he came to the conclusion, looking at all the cases, that that was the reason. It was that games are systems. A game itself is supplied by the players. Systems are shells into which users pour meaning. So here's, today's problem, Google Clips. Some lawyers have suggested you have no copyright over the films made by your Google Clips because it's being made by AI. That's got to be wrong. And the reason I suggest that that is wrong is all the data for the clips that are made are coming from you. You're setting it up so that when the dog goes by, it'll take a picture of the dog. Or it'll take a little film of the dog. And yes, it's the AI doing it, but you're supplying all the data. The house, the set. Think of it in terms of set design. So ask yourself, are we simultaneously both audience and co-creator? Especially if we're talking about a VR world of entertainment or media or advertising that is being composed of our brain data, of our feedback, of our incredibly individualized natures. If we're effectively co-authors, where does that put us on the copyright spectrum? This has happened before. You can look at the Statute of Anne, which was the original copyright statute, and say, oh, well, we created a bundle of rights for authors, and we created a positive economic consequence. That's actually not the only interpretation. I would suggest the better interpretation, the better legal interpretation, is to go back in history and realize that authors had no right of control over their own work. It all belonged to the king. It all belonged to the state. If the state wanted to censor your work, that was the end of that. It didn't belong to you. And that the Statute of Anne was the final in a number of steps, which we don't have time to get into, that increasingly put control back in the author's hands. Before it was in the author's hands, the king delegated it to Parliament. Parliament delegated it to guilds. And then it moved eventually kind of from the guild to the individual author, with the publisher somewhere in there. For a while, publishers had all the control. So, final thing. The algorithmic you is not you. It's not 100% accurate, as my daughter pointed out. The person we show to be ourselves in media is just a superficial snapshot of us. I think I'm going to go to this because this is my favorite. This is my old boss, who was the CEO of CTV. I was talking to him about this the other day, and he said, look, algorithms are at best a snapshot of today, and maybe even more dangerous, a look through the rearview mirror. So, what is important here, what is reinforced, is that our human agency, I guess I'm going now to the positive place, is a positive, individuated creative force. And so ultimately, whatever it's combined with, we own a whole lot of it. AI being based on algorithms can't account for the creative inputs that they get. Those come from us. So we are indeed co-creators. And this is one of my favorite quotes from the only judge who's ever really been identified as post-structuralist. When these ghosts of the past, talking about old law, stand in the path of justice, clanking their medieval chains, the proper course is for the judge to pass through them undeterred. So my conclusion is to say, we've got to make claims of co-authorship when our personal data is used. That doesn't preempt any of the other remedies that I talked about. This will turn into an article, and just go through this. The end, thank you very much. And that's what I learned from the internet.